Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and tonight we're going to discuss the Anunnaki, Nibiru, the Sumerian tablets, the translations of Zecharia Sitchin. We have an awesome guest with us tonight, folks, and I'm going to pick his brain, so be prepared for a paradigm-shattering, mind-altering discussion. We have Gerald R. Clark with us, author, researcher, electronics guru. He used to be a senior design engineer for Lockheed Martin. He's been a vice president for multiple companies. And I can't even get into the type of work that he did because I just don't understand it. So we're really going to have a good time tonight. And he had the opportunity to travel the globe with several different corporations. And throughout his career, it has allowed him to visit amazing locations that are just so far advanced that even the technology we have today, some of this stuff probably couldn't be replicated. So it's great to have you on the show with us, Gerald. Really appreciate it. I know it's late where you're at, so how's it going?
Really great, Rex, and warm welcome to you and all your guests. And I'm really excited about this show because I know how much interest you have in it.
Well, it's always been something that sparked my interest. I grew up Christian. My parents were Christian, not real hardcore, but would go to church, a few times every other month, I guess. And just, it was cool. I really liked it, but I never really felt like I was getting the whole truth. Great people, good energy. However, if you read the Bible and you look at it from a technical standpoint, it's just very difficult to grasp because it seems as if so many things contradict each other. And there's so many different books and translations and reference points that you can come up with that it's tough to really grasp what it was like that many years ago when they put it together. So then I found out about Zecharia Sitchin and the 12th Planet, I think, is the first book that he came up with, the Sumerian tablets that he translated, and it talked about these fallen angels or these, spacemen, the Anunnaki that came from the heavens. And they basically altered the original people on Earth to be their slaves and to get gold for their atmosphere and stuff because their planet was depleting the atmosphere. And that kind of made sense as far as how there was this big jump that most scientists today and archaeologists and stuff can't explain in the human paradigm. So that kind of made sense to me. But I'd like to get into some questions that I have for you because you are so well versed in this. And I was just kind of hoping, too, that you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what I didn't touch on, and really why you got into this kind of research as well.
Well, I grew up like you. I was a Southern Baptist, so I was pretty ensconced in believing the Bible was the Word of God. And I saw this word God, and I kept seeing it all over the places I traveled, and it started to bother me that no one really knew who this being was, especially if you'd never been exposed to the source documents that we're going to talk about tonight. So that wasn't even really on my mind. But I was like you. I saw real inconsistencies in the nature of this God that was described in the Old Testament and the one that, most of us Baptists ascribe to, which was the New Testament. One was a God of wrath and vengeance in the Old Testament, and the one in the New Testament seemed to be pretty benevolent toward mankind. So, so we kind of ignore the one in the Old Testament, let the Jewish people deal with that one, and then the Christians would take the New Testament and be all focused on that one.
Right.
So, but it did create real issues in my mind, especially the book of Genesis, and you're correct. The 12th Planet was Sitchin's first book, and he did spend a lot of time showing you evidence. Here's this tablet. Look at this one, and trying to make it. He was trying to justify this unbelievable theory that most of the scientific people and the academics were dissing him over, because he was like Wilhelm Reich. Or what was it? What was the guy's name who discovered Troy? I can't remember his name. He was a German though. But the same problem with him is the academics dissed him, and so he was pretty much out on his own with his own resources. And so I kind of saw that with Sitchin as well. And Sitchin, he left himself open, I think, by writing the Lost Book of Enki and not giving any sources for it. I think it was a great book, and I think it wove together a lot of the pieces that he had from various sources to tell the big story, which he did very well. He was a great writer. But never felt like I could reference that book without references, so I never really talk about that one. But the 12th Planet really opened my eyes to the Sumerian documents, and I'd been looking for a culture that had the earliest writing, so I could kind of go back to the source and go, well, where did this technological chasm come between different civilizations? That's how I was approaching it. And then I read, I think, Genesis Revisited from him, and this really made me go back and read the Bible again closely. And I started seeing things from the perspective now, having read all the Sumerian documents, that made a lot more sense to me. And with that perspective, you could differentiate the truth from a lie a lot more readily. And so when you go back and read Genesis 1, and you see that that these gods, plural, created man in our image and our likeness, and then go read the Atrahasis account, where a council meeting of the Anunnaki specified exactly that, and I mean plural. There were 6 men and 6 women on this council. So, you start seeing those kind of correlations as well once you've read the Sumerian documents, which predated the Bible by a very long time. All of a sudden, you realize that what you have there that's called the Word of God isn't completely true. And there were political agendas in writing that book. If you truly understand the circumstances the Hebrew people were in as they were being held captive in Babylon, where they first saw these documents, these Sumerian documents. Okay, so what do we know? What is your specific question about the prehistory of Nibiru, this planet that they say they come from? And then we can kind of walk from there into the main players and who did what to whom and how we ended up where we are now. That kind of will give us a platform to maybe discuss a little more.
Great.
Correlations with how we go forward, because that's once you realize all this stuff, it takes a long time to process it, and some people years. Okay, this is like tearing out every belief system you have, and all of a sudden you're faced with this truth that's in stone, that's sitting up in museums, where you can either ignore it or synthesize it and realize what they were saying probably was not a lie, even though it was called a myth by by the conquering cultures, right?
Well, and here's one thing that I'd like to make a point. As far as different religions and cultures and beliefs, that's one of the amazing things about being a human being, is we have the right to think for ourselves and believe what we want to. So, whatever take or mindset you have on religion, divine providence, God, if you believe in multiple gods, if you're an atheist, whatever, this is tonight just an opportunity to hear about stuff that's been documented throughout history, and the translations that are discussed have, there's multiple sources that collaborate and say, yes, this is what happened. So whether or not you want to believe it or it's 100% accurate, that's up for debate, and that's fine for you to believe. But a lot of this information it's cutting edge, because this is stuff that's been suppressed for thousands of years. When the Crusades took place, and anything that wasn't a part of the system church at that time, was looked at as blasphemy, witchcraft, and people were burned at the stake. Libraries and tons of information was destroyed because of this. So a lot of this information and what you're talking about predates the books of the Bible. And that's just incredible. So I would like to talk about the 6 women and the 6 men that were part of it, and we'll get into some of the names and the correlations of the biblical references, maybe the Greek gods, and maybe even if they connect to the Vedic gods, Valhalla and some of the Nordics and stuff. But my question was about Nibiru. Is the official version that I know about of the Anunnaki when they came to Earth was to look for gold. Is that correct?
Well, that is correct. If we start back on the prehistory of Nibiru, There was a king that ends up as the main progenitor in the Anunnaki line that we like to include in the story because he was head of the Anunnaki Council, and his name was Anu.
Okay, so Anu
Okay.
was the original king, or as far back as you can go, it was Anu.
Right, and we're circa 450,000 years ago right now. And according to their records, one of the beings who was the prior king, his name was Lama. Excuse me. He was discussing problems in their atmosphere, whether to bolster their atmosphere to protect themselves against radiation using the volcanoes to reactivate them by firing missiles into them, or to create a particulate solution to seed the atmosphere. And this was a discussion they were having way back then, because you have to understand in the myths of Mesopotamia, there's a document in there called the Atrahasis, written by Stephanie Dalley. And the document is, I'm sorry, the Enuma Elish. There's Atrahasis as well, but the Enuma Elish is the Babylonian or the Sumerian cosmogony, which essentially describes how our solar system came to be. And why it's important to them is because, according to the account, their planetary system, we call it the Nibiru constellation, all right? It looks like they have a mini sun and about 7 planets total. And each planet may have a couple of satellites.
Okay.
Well, anyway, this constellation somehow, according to their record, in this allegory of this epic battle in space with, think of the planets as billiard balls that are just flying around. Well, they somehow got trapped into our sun's orbit, in a retrograde orbit, according to them, that they weren't in before. And after the first time through, they described all the things they were doing at the inner planets to prepare themselves for shielding radiation, have to blow this up to get it out of the way, all these kind of things. And we didn't really understand it until we got a little more scientific, I think. They were talking about using weapons that could split an entire planet.
And that reminds me of like a Type 2 civilization.
Right. So anyway, they had atmospheric problems without getting too lost there. They're in a 3600 retrograde orbit, according to them. They kept time in that method in what was called a shar. Even the Sumerian kings list, their reigns were listed in shars. Okay, and if you read the Sumerian kings list that was given to us by Berossus, it shows the first one having a reign of 8 shars, which turns out to be 28,800 years. As unbelievable as that is, and we'll get to that. Okay, but keep that in mind. So they got trapped in this retrograde orbit. It gives them a platform, a moving platform, to see all the other planets that are already in this space. Well, they didn't get out that easily. They apparently had some collisions about the second time around their 3,600-year orbit, such that one of the satellites of Nibiru struck a planet that was in the place where the Earth is now. They called it Tiamat. It broke part of it off. Part of it became the Earth, and the other part became the asteroid belt. And at that point, one of the moons of Nibiru apparently got stuck in its orbit, and they called that one Kingu, which is our moon, which is unusually large for our planet, you have to admit. So anyway, so a lot of these stories they told in this Enuma Elish account, we're now verifying scientifically that what they said is true. And this document is quite old. So from there, they needed a solution, because if you imagine a planetary system coming into perihelion with the sun every 3,600 years, what it would do to your atmosphere. It'd probably strip it of various components that would normally be there, either through magnetic effects, through plasma discharge and radiating it, who knows, okay? But apparently they had this need to keep bolstering their atmosphere, which, and I think they knew in the long run it was a losing battle to continue to do this. They needed a long-term solution, and I think that's partly where the Earth came in their long-term plans. But anyway, they had an occlusion account in their Enuma Elish with the Earth, so they knew about it, and they called the planet Ki. Okay, and they counted from the outside in, from their perspective, since when they were out aphelion, they were the farthest planet out. So they counted inward, the planets inward, and that if you count that way, the Earth is number 7. That's why I named my second book The Seventh Planet. Okay. So with this problem that they had, the king Anu decided to dispatch his chief scientist, who was called Enki. It was his firstborn son. He was sent to the Earth to do a couple of things. One of the primary things was to find resources to bolster the atmosphere back on Nibiru as they were coming into perihelion with the sun again. So Some accounts show that he was looking in the Persian Gulf initially. That's where he splashed down and built the city of Eridu, which is right there where the Tigris and the Euphrates meet, running through the Sea of Reeds into the Persian Gulf. Okay, so that's according to him. If he did that when he said he did it, that city's 450,000 years old, and it's still sitting there in the desert in Iraq, pretty much, pretty much. I don't know, like a pile of rubble.
Jeez.
Anyway, so that's pretty amazing. So he came, tried to get colloidal gold out of the oceans. Apparently, if it's already in a colloidal solution, or you can use chemicals to do it and derive it that way, you already got a powder-like form that you can ionize in the atmosphere. It's very simple. Whereas, if you take gold and have to smelt it somehow to get it to a powder form or a form that could be sprayed, think about how you would do that. Would you just make it little tiny particles that you'd spray up there? It'd be too heavy. It would just fall out of the atmosphere, right? So that'd be very, very small particles. So that was about 450,000 years ago. So Enki means Lord of the Earth, by the way. So his initial title was Lord of the Earth. His half brother Enlil was still back on Nibiru, and he was born of his father Anu and his half sister, Anu's half sister, whose name was Arash, or her other name was Ki. She was nicknamed Ki, Arash. So she ended up giving birth to Enlil, and because she was a half-sister, and because of mitochondrial DNA contributions in the purity of their bloodline, he was in line to rule. Enki was not. So at this point, we're in the Persian Gulf, and Enki's trying to get gold. He brought a small band of workers with him, which he called the Ajiji. They also referred to him in the Book of Enoch as the Watchers. These were highly technical fellow gods that generally ran spacecraft, low Earth drones, all kinds of technical things to watch the state of the simulator to report back to the higher ups, okay, whether it was an asteroid coming in or too much radiation, just whatever, okay. That's partly why they were called the Watchers. So they were there to assist Enki in getting this gold from the Persian Gulf. Apparently they didn't get it fast enough. 5,000 years elapsed. They ended up being vectored to South Africa, where the Atrahasis document picks up. So at this point, apparently they weren't getting gold fast enough from the Persian Gulf, and they got vectored down to Africa, where they could mine it more significantly. This is where the Atrahasis picked up. And in the beginning of this first tablet of the Atrahasis, it describes them casting lots to divide up the territories between some of the key players that we should lay out here. We've already mentioned Anu and Enki. Enlil was the other one. The one we didn't mention was the half-sister to both of them, whose name was Nin Hartzog. And later on, we'll find out her name was Isis in Egypt. She was the medical officer that accompanied them. She was very important, because if one of them had a child with her, it would be in line to rule, because of this half-sister mitochondrial DNA thing. So she was kind of a key player for that reason as well. Okay. So they end up casting lots. Enki gets Africa. Anu goes back to Nibiru. Enlil gets Mesopotamia. And the exemption is that the Temple of Eridu and the city that Enki built there with his original Ijiji Watchers still belong to him. And apparently he had a garden there, and he'd done all kinds of things in 5,000 years until his brother showed up. At this point, they've divided the territory. I left Inanna out. She got the Indus Valley. Okay, and Enki's in Africa. Oh, and the medical officer actually got some territory. Even though she was a medical officer, she got given the Bond Heaven Earth region up in the Sinai Peninsula that belonged to the Anunnaki. Now, this was the area where they had their, I guess you would call it, their communication facilities.
Okay.
And also transport facilities for moving the ore back to Nibiru, whether it went directly or via a way station.
I'm thinking of those in Peru or somewhere out there. They had those ginormous, like, landing pads and very big, kind of, I guess, sculptures of different animals and stuff like that. Was that done by the Anunnaki? Like, was that to give them an idea from space?
It very well could have. There have been several races, I believe, that have visited the Earth and done prospecting here. And I think there have been somewhat controversies between races of vying for those, resources from the Earth. So, resource wars and genetic wars, both. Excuse me. Okay, so let's go back to Africa. We've now got the main players. They've divided the territories. And these Ajiji watchers are signed up to come down to Africa and mine the gold manually versus this colloidal method they were originally planning to do from the ocean. Well, this is hard work. And they were understaffed. And it says they worked for an entire shar, which is 3,600 years, before they finally revolted, being led by one of their fellow gods, which they referred to as Allah. Gee, where have we heard that name before?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so he has an AKA list, just like many of these other ones do. And when you find out who they are, I think it'll make a lot more sense to what's going on in the world. Understand that Enki was a scientist. He probably wasn't a great organizational guy. He was more of a creator. And Enlil was more of a bureaucratic type commander. So, he was kind of an in-charge kind of guy. Well, these workers weren't getting the gold fast enough, and Enlil ended up going down to Africa and had a fortress there right outside of these mines that are down in South Africa. Okay, some people have written books about these structures that have been found in South Africa that are described by the Sumerians, and we have gold mines that have been found down there and purchased by the Anglo-American Mining Corporation that date back thousands of years, actually hundreds of thousands of years. So all of a sudden, there raises a flag right there. The Sumerian documents say somebody was in South Africa mining gold 100,000 or more years ago. And now we have the mines from the Anglo-American Mining Corporation that were verified by archaeologists to be at this same time frame. So you have to ask yourself, who was mining gold 100,000 plus years ago in Africa? Okay, there's correlation number one. Okay, this really happened. Okay, so apparently this rebel leader, Allah, riled them up, told them to burn their tools. They surrounded Enlil's house, told them they wanted relief, and this led to the next big event in the human milestone, which was our creation account. You with me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay, so a council meeting was called when these rebels surrounded Enlil's house. He called his father Anu and a few of the other council members from the Anunnaki Council to decide what to do about this. He volunteered to kill one, and Anu and Enki said no, they deserve relief. Well, this led to them discussing tools versus meat. Okay, are we going to use biological entities to continue this operation, or are we going to use advanced tools? Well, for some reason, they didn't choose tools, and I talk about this in my second book, why they probably did that. But they did dispatch Enki and his half-sister Ninmah, who was, like I said, Isis in Egypt, to go off and do a genetic experiment with the life forms that they found on this earth. They described that in the Atrahasis tablets. Like I said, this isn't from Sitchin, and I'm definitely not a Sitchin basher, but he pointed us to this document, okay? So it's very important. So they did their experiments, finally came up with a worker that could replace the Ajiji miners. And at that point, they couldn't procreate. So the next character comes in, who was Enki's other son, and his name was Ningshita. And at this point in the story, it's probably good to talk about symbols, but we'll talk about their symbols right about the time they leave Africa and go up to Enki's city, Eridu, in the Garden of Eden. Okay, so at this point they can't procreate, and they've been producing them via in vitro fertilization and not meeting the labor demands fast enough. Okay, and the medical officers involved and some of the other Anunnaki females are involved in this as well. So just like breeding experiments where you might end up with an impotency problem, they had that same problem. So this is where Enki's son Ningshita came in and decided to study the genetics of these beings that they'd created, this Adamu. And he noted that they needed an X and Y chromosome, the genetic material for reproduction. And so he did the gene splicing, fixed them up, and next thing you know, they're on their way up to Mesopotamia, back to the city of Eridu, which was Enki's city, recall, that he built with his 50 Ajiji workers. And they decide to study these beings to see if they can procreate. And this is where your Garden of Eden story comes, where God, the God of the Old Testament, remember? Well, now you'll realize Enki and Enlil were in the garden. And Enki was carrying the caduceus because that was his symbol with the entwined snakes going around a pole, right? We see this in the healthcare industry.
Right,
Well,
right. The
oh
DNA
yeah, yeah.
strand
Well,
deal.
this actually was indicative of the fact that he was a geneticist. Okay, so these were the double helix of the DNA that he was showing with an alchemical symbol as part of it that he probably wasn't disclosing all of it to his brother. Imagine he had the ability to go design some genetic being. His brother's the commander, and now they're going to be able to reproduce on their own, which would be a huge threat to his brother, especially since he contributed his own reproductive material to a bipedal hominid zygote that they in vitro fertilized in his half sister.
Right.
Okay, so he's probably very suspicious of
Now that
what
you
he,
put it that way.
and he hasn't really, like, okay, here's the genetic code and actually the sequencing, and he didn't disclose hardly anything, I'm sure. And he was apparently just brilliant. I mean, whether he should have done it or not, that's another matter, and we can talk about that later. But so they show up in the garden to watch to see if they can procreate. And what does Enlil say? The one playing God. He says, "Don't eat any of these. You can eat anything from the garden, but don't eat this one, or you'll die." Right? Pretty severe. Well, this is Enki's garden, right? That Enlil's in. So who is he to be telling them this in the first place? But anyway, then Enki shows up, the evil snake, right? Who's in opposition to his brother. And by the way, you're going to find out sooner rather than later that these two did not get along. Enki his title means Lord of the Earth, and now his brothers there are breathing down his neck playing commander. Imagine. And his title is Enlil. That means Lord of the Air. Right? So that's what their names mean. So they were trying to divide territories so they didn't step on each other because these were powerful forces to be reckoned with. If you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
Okay, so at this point, the Adam and Eve couple are witnessed and eating this plant, whatever it was, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, guess what? They became sentient and conscious of the fact that they weren't clothed, which was a symbolic gesture or allusion to higher consciousness. They chose higher consciousness over not doing it at the fear of being killed over it, right? So they were willing to die for higher consciousnesses, essentially, whether they understood it or not. That's what they did.
That's
Well,
pretty
look what
powerful.
happened. Look what happened. They ate the plant and they didn't die. So the first one lied to them. Period. He lied. And the second one that told them they would wake up and become aware, well, that's exactly what happened. So the second one told them the truth and was demonized for it, right? He's the evil snake. What a bunch of crap.
Well, you always learn about the history from the victors.
Oh, exactly. Well, that's why the Sumerian tales are called mythology, or anything that is to be debased and made to be not important. You give it some label that de-elevates it from importance. It's just a myth. You know. Well, that's what Sitchin did differently than others. He read this and assumed it wasn't a myth and tried to look at it from more of a scientific standpoint to figure out what was it they were saying and what capabilities they have. And so if you just read the Atrahasis, any person that reads this tablet and sees what they did to produce an offspring would realize that we can do that today. So why would you think they couldn't have done it then? Especially if they apparently could travel from A to B from another planet and probably had a little more time to evolve than we did.
And that was one of the things that I had questioned, and I still question, as far as the official story of the Anunnaki coming to Earth to harvest gold. Now, obviously, everything breaks down to a certain frequency, and things break down to certain amounts of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And they've been able to produce small amounts of gold with, I think, lead or some other substance, but the amount of energy that it takes it's just not worth it. So if you're such an advanced race and you can live hundreds of thousands of years and travel the stars, I often wonder, well, why couldn't they just come up with a synthetic version on their own planet? Why do they have to go to Earth and then genetically modify the Earth beings at that time? And then have you heard of Credo Mutwa?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, he talks about, the mystery schools and secret teachings that he has been given from previous generations and then from previous generations. And he talks about how the original Earth people were so telepathic that if they were hungry, and they were all balanced perfectly, but as an example, I remember one thing he writes about was if woman or man, it was actually man and woman was one. There was no separation. So it was a being that was androgynous, I guess, or whatever. So essentially, it was so telepathic, though, that it would think to itself, I'm hungry, and an animal would come over, literally bow its head down, to be lunch for that person or whatever. So, and then these beings came from space and offered the Earth people an opportunity to evolve, or they offered them like some type of present or some ability, and they looked at them as like gods. And what they did was they changed them genetically. They offered them a chance to go to the right, or like to the blue mountain, it was called in these mystery schools, or the red mountain, I think, or something like that. So it just makes you wonder if that was the case, and if they did come here and they changed man to where after they came out of that, they didn't have that telepathic communication with Source anymore. It was just a much different environment. And he also talked about how they were confused because they used to be able to talk telepathically, but after that, they had to speak in words and they couldn't understand each other properly. And that's how war started, and confusion, and just all these different scenarios of chaos, I guess. So do you think that there might be a possibility that when they came here and they did change the original Earth people, that it actually might have caused, certain problems to take us away from Source?
Well, I think that's exactly what happened. Is when you read how Enki infused the energy from one of the beings who'd been sacrificed in creating this first avatar. First of all, I want to pin that term down right now. What we're talking about here is the creation of an avatar, right? This is a control of energy and matter that we truly don't have a grasp on yet. I know we want to understand how to take the consciousness, upload it to a computer, save it, and then put it in another host, but these guys apparently could do that. That's amazing. So really, in general, at this point, if you found out that they did a genetic modification and you didn't know it, and you found out you were born as a slave, at that point you start asking yourself, well, what are the limits of the genetic constructs they gave us? How were we created? What's the template? And a couple of them, they told us. They told us they gave us intelligence, and they also told us that they clamped our lifespan at 120 years. And this is also in the Bible, by the way.
Right.
It's in the Sumerian tablets. So in my first book, I looked up to see if anybody had broken that 120-year age limit. And there was a couple people that had done it. One of them got to 122, but not much more than that. But that genetic clamp they put on us seemed pretty accurate. So this brings up a very, very deep question about how did they construct us? Were we only ever supposed to be the slaves in the Garden of Eden that Enlil wanted us? Keep them stupid, naked, dumb as animals, as long as they can do what we direct them to do, whether it's with words or the electromagnetic spectrum. And this is where it gets kind of crazy. They designed these beings because they had an uprising with the Ajiji in the first place. You think they didn't spend significant effort designing constructs into us so that they could monitor the intent to rebel or anything that smelled like that, so they could put that out? So I'm telling you right now, if you start thinking scientifically from where they were probably at when they created us, they knew about the electromagnetic spectrum. They knew about photons, muons, and leptons, and they understood how a meat host operates in an energetic environment and how that all works. How you create an avatar is what I'm telling you. You think about that. That's crazy. They understood that. Well, so if that's the case, do you think they couldn't control you through frequency in some way to give you commands so that you do what you were supposed to do as a group, as an individual? Of course they could. So what you're saying is originally we could very well have been an advanced species that they, even possibly from another planet, or the Atlanteans that they decided to enslave. And part of the DNA might have come from them. Part of it might have come from a bipedal hominid. Who knows? They were playing all kinds of chimera games. But I want you to think real hard about what our constraints are. Think about our five senses and how limited they are in frequency and sensitivity in this on the Earth compared to animals. Even we really got clamped pretty hard, is what I'm telling you.
Well, I mean, we do only see, I've brought this up before, about 0.01% of the electromagnetic light spectrum. Then our brain filters out about 50% of that based upon our life experiences and the way that we think. So, I mean, there's a lot out there that we're not seeing and hearing and feeling, and just so many amazing senses. And some people have the opportunity to tap into their sixth sense because of maybe not only natural abilities, but their practical exercises, meditation, and things that they do. And so there's a lot of different things out there. And that brings me to the question, if they were able to control people via mind electronically back then, and you look at the way things are today, I've often discussed with people that have asked me questions like, well, Rex, with as easy as it is for hackers out there to just to take over grids, and with the Stuxnet virus and so much bad in the world and so many crazy people, why isn't there somebody out there that's so disgruntled? Why don't they go do something that would actually have a big impact like you see in the movies, right? Because you never really see anything like that in real life. I mean, yeah, there's the occasional thing that happens, but nothing ever really that big. So why is that? I wonder, and they wonder. And I said, it probably has something to do with there's like this blanket control of this electronic frequency or something that just keeps people that might be on the edge of snapping, like maybe a disgruntled postal worker or veteran or something like that, or whatever. I'm being kind of sarcastic when I said the postal worker. I was joking around, but
Yeah.
you know what I mean.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a very good point. Let's just get real specific. In the human brain, is there an organism that is sensitive to the electromagnetic frequency that could somehow be turned into a thought? That's the question, right?
Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, then the next question is anybody doing that to humans? And we find out there's plenty of evidence. For the first one, if you dive deep into the brain, you'd see, and I discuss this in my first book, that you can essentially introduce a carrier wave with data on it, and it could be voice, it could be images, it could be whatever, just data, into the human brain without going through the auditory canal. And this is, this really, I mean, it may be presented to the ear, but it may be done at a frequency that the ear can't hear. But when you mix these frequencies together, you can actually cause a resultant frequency that lands inside your brainwave region that could put an image or even a dialogue inside your head. And I think Jesse Ventura on his conspiracy show went up to meet some guy at the HARP facility in Alaska. There's some doctor who had a device to demonstrate this principle to him. But this is what I was describing in the book. So in general, if somebody can transmit in your brainwave region, and if the signal is higher than the one that you're generating, that one's going to dominate yours. So it's pretty simple. If it's in delta, theta, alpha, or beta of your brainwave segments, how we have them partitioned from about 0.5 hertz up to 20 to 60 hertz, depending on which literature you're looking at.
Right.
If you're transmitting in that region, and you play some games, you can directly control humans. So without getting too detailed into that, the reality is the electromagnetic spectrum and your meat host, essentially the short answer is your interface to that electromagnetic spectrum is you're a meat modem. Not only do you receive energy from the electromagnetic spectrum and light and quantum energy and all kinds of things, magnetism, gravity, but you also are transmitting. So every thought that you have, that you formulate, ends up as a signal that can be monitored in the brain. Well, any electrical signal, for anybody who knows this, travels through infinite space. So that signal doesn't just stop just because it's bouncing around your head. You're transmitting it through the electromagnetic spectrum. And if someone had the technology, they could aim a device at your head with a low noise amplifier and take that brainwave thought and convert it into the symbols or whatever um, bidirectional memory model that they have set up for humans, which, by the way, we do have. So we know how that works. So the end result of all that is you were designed in a way where everything that you think is transmitted. I mean, even the telemetry of your body can be received remotely. Heart rate, respiratory rate, everything. Okay? So when the Bible says that, quote unquote, God knows the number of hairs on your head, well, if they know about your genetics, they can determine that, right? So I
Right.
want you to think about that. And nothing you've ever said, done, or seen is a secret. You were designed as a telemetry host to be dropped into remote situations and planets and be their avatar agent. And nothing has changed. Nothing.
Yeah, let me jump in real quick, Gerald, because you're bringing up some really cool topics here. And have you ever personally, before you discovered all this, just wondered those kind of questions like, man, am I looking at stuff and is this being somehow recorded into the Akashic records or for some future race or entity or somebody to be able to tap into? Or that's pretty incredible.
Oh, I had the experience. I felt like it was happening by
Right.
direct.
Yeah.
I think it happens to a lot of authors. Actually, it's a crazy experience. But yeah,
Yeah, it's incredible. I just wanted to bring that up.
well, I think about this. Since the '60s, our three-letter agencies have had the ability to read a license plate from space
Yeah,
and demodulate brainwaves. So they've been able to read your brainwaves and decode them since the '60s.
sure. I
So I
mean,
want
absolutely.
So think about yourself as a human antenna and a transmitter. So whatever energy is going on in your body, they can sense that too. Whether it's first chakra all the way up to seventh chakra, which one's working, which one isn't. Brainwave activity, is your corpus callosum allowing lateral ventricle fluid bidirectionally go across? How awake is this being is what I'm telling you. So they can read your intent just from your energy body and your thoughts. Now think about this: if these Anunnaki built these replacement workers and they didn't want any revolts again, that would make sense that they would have that kind of snooping ability onto our meat host, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And if they could just track it at any time and have algorithms, so if some particular, being over there wasn't following orders or was starting to think about getting other ones together and saying, "Hey, let's revolt," well, these algorithms pick that up and then they can immediately swarm over there and they
That's
can
right.
take
That's
out the
right.
subject.
Pre-crime, just like in Minority Report. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, that's how bad the enslavement is. So I don't want to spend too much more time on that. But a couple other corroborating events I usually throw in because people start from the Bible, believe it's the true word of God, and there's a lot of truth in the Bible. Don't get me wrong, but you need to understand who God is. So let's and there's thousands of names for
But
God all across the
let me
planet.
ask one question if I can real quick before we move on to the next thing and it's about the
Okay, yeah, yeah.
it's about the chakras because I've heard before that they were they're kind of like a bad thing. I've heard that it can be good. I've heard that it can be bad. But one person in particular, George Kavasilis, he's a nice guy. I talked to him several years ago. He's supposedly made contact with many different interstellar and extra dimensional races, and he talked about the chakras and how they were basically implanted from ETs. When we were created to be kind of like a control source. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it depends. It's always like how you use technology. Why would they put in I'll just call it quantized sequence of nerve ganglia that they call these chakras? By the way, each one has a different wavelength of light that it seems to resonate,
Okay.
which is very interesting. And these are parameters we can measure. So think about this. So why would Enki create a being and augment it possibly with some latent DNA that could be triggered at some future point in time or under some circumstance that he designed? Who knows? Whether it's going through the galactic center or showing certain symbols that trigger this in the being, right? Well, this seems like that's partly true as we start to study our quote unquote junk DNA. So why would he do this? What agenda did he have with his brothers such that he felt like these beings shouldn't just be dumbed down slaves that get driven to death of mining and dredging rivers and building buildings? What if What if he was a little more benevolent then? And he decided that I'm going to put the constructs in them to allow them to evolve spiritually and physically to the same place we are over some period of time under some circumstances, and I'll be in control of the catalysts that allow them iteratively more consciousness. And by the way, that correlates exactly with the Mayan calendar if you look at the Zolkin calendar. They talked about these 9 stages and the frequency dispensations that cause different life forms. Well, Timothy Leary wrote a lot about these circuits, and when you look at them, it looks like there's 8 of them in a human that correspond to the stages we go through in our life of waking up. So, so as far as the chakras, why would he put into a construct within us to allow us to take on more and more consciousness until we achieve, this highest level that can be measured, by the way, with lots of different kind of imaging equipment now? Why would he do that? Because he didn't want us to be enslaved forever. He knew, I think, in his heart that at some point in the future that slavery was going to be cast off, that they couldn't be controlled because he had created them to slowly turn into the Anunnaki. As a matter of fact, he says that in some of his writings. We have become them. We may not be as big as they are, and we may have clamps on our DNA, but it's possible that those clamps could be taken off energetically in one fell swoop. Who knows, right? Change of a brainwave frequency that goes into your brain that is modulated this particular way, and it unlocks some genetic trigger. Who knows for sure, right?
Right.
So So I think he was at odds with Enlil over access to higher consciousness, and this is really the real battle for humans all through history. Is how do we get to the truth about where we came from, where we're going? Because if you had all that, you wouldn't be susceptible to all the BS and the lies. But so Enki seemed to be the same persona as Prometheus, in that he gave life to us, but and also was benevolent to us to the best that he could without getting walked all over by those who didn't want him to.
Okay. And then, go ahead.
Well, so, this brings up the whole Noah story that people talk about. And we can do that one, which I've done so many times. I'd actually like to skip that one and actually go to the real source of what caused my head to spin around when I was looking at this data. And that was the lamentations, the documents that were found in the city of Ur. Now, you have to understand the Anunnaki had several cities before the last big flood, Noah's flood, if you will, and they had cities before that as well. And the last flood, I think, was approximately 12,000 years ago. That's what all the records seem to indicate, and it also corresponds with the DNA samples of the ewes. And so Enlil was the chief deity of the city of Ur. Now, so there was Ur and Nippur and Eridu, like I told you, was the very first city, and Bad Tabira and Sippar and Nineveh, several of them, okay? Well, he was the chief deity of the city of Ur, or Nippur, but he also had a presence in the city of Ur, which was very important to them. This was kind of Ur Nippur was like their mission control center, okay? This was where Enlil was totally about that place. That was his. Remember I told you they drew lots in the beginning.
Right.
And he got that territory, so that was his. Okay, so as you're reading into these documents, realizing that the progenitor of all 3 world's religions came from that city, okay? And his name was Abram before he got renamed, right? And he had a brother named Haran, and they had a nephew named Lot, right? So you know about that story. Well, all of a sudden you realize that Abram's father, Terah, was serving this deity in the Ziggurat temple at Ur, who was none other than Enlil. There wasn't anybody else there. It was his territory, remember? And all of a sudden you realize out of this area that Abram became the patriarchal figure for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Well, you ask yourself why. Why was this being whose father was serving as the chief priest to Enlil, who, by the way, was also called Yahweh? So all of a sudden now you come into the canonical Bible realizing who this being was and where he's from, and you go, wow, this is the source of it all right here. He was also known as El Shaddai and several other names. Jehovah, Okay, those were names for Enlil. And all of a sudden you go, oh, OMG, right? This was the one that was calling himself God in the Garden of Eden in the city of Eridu. So all of a sudden the veil is lifted. Do you see it?
Enlil is
The
basically. So
bureaucratic.
how did you get that connection with all the different names that you just brought up? Like
Well, I had to do a genealogy table to keep track of all these crazy names, and I have it on my website for sale. I actually ended up doing a vinyl scroll that's about 3 feet by 8 foot tall, with all the names on there, so you can follow these through. Okay, but all I had to do was see Enlil's name. Oh, and by the way, his son Allah, Nanar Sin was another name for him, was the king of that city in the second dynasty. So now all of a sudden you realize the rebel down in the damn mines was his kid. You think he's going to be kind to his kid for what he did, causing a disruption in the gold mining processing? Milestones that his dad, Anu, was probably very concerned about. So all of a sudden, these major names are falling out in religion. Let's just do those now. So Enlil is Yahweh. He's the one that's portrayed as God in the Old Testament. He's the one that tells the Levites to go kill each other with a sword, right in Exodus 32:20. Okay, the same God of wrath and vengeance. Well, guess what? There's a lamentation of Ur in my second book where he blows up the city of Ur while Nanar, who's Allah, and his wife were in the city. They barely escaped. Apparently, Nanar was injured. So, so now you're starting to find out the real story of who these beings were. Okay, so who was Jesus, and who was Enki? What role was he playing? Now that you found out that Enlil was playing the God role and Enki was portrayed as this evil snake, well, now all of a sudden you realize those roles are just the opposite. Just the opposite. How do we know this? Enlil went on a tirade to get rid of the humans about 600 years after that primitive worker experiment, if you read the Atrahasis and read it closely. Not only did he introduce communicable diseases that killed people twice, cut off the food and the water supply, but that's when he ordered the flood by his brother, Lord of the Seas. Instead of the Lord of the Earth, he got disambiguated with his brother, and he got assigned the oceans. Well, where does that ring a bell? Now we know that Enlil, while we're doing the names, was Zeus. Okay, we know this without question. And Enki, his brother and nemesis, was Poseidon, the chief deity of Atlantis. These names start to fill in the blanks for you now. Now we got Allah. We got who supposedly God or Jehovah was. And now all of a sudden you find out that the one who actually did the genetic experiment to create us was none other than Enki and his half sister, who was Isis. Well, she had other names all through many cultures as well.
Another thing too is I'm thinking about the Old Testament talking about people living 800 years, 900 years, and then after the flood, it's 120 years. So was that also because of a rebellion or something like that? So they decided to kind of, I guess you could say nip it in the bud.
Well, you're referring to the genealogy table in Genesis from Adam to Noah,
Mm-hmm.
and in that account, several beings lived up to 900 years, and I think Methuselah lived up to 960 something years. He was the oldest. Well, those ages are incredible, but if you look back to the Sumerian kings list, we have just a couple before the flood and then after the flood. And before the flood, it's quite amazing. If you look at their rulerships and the cities they were in this area in southern Iraq and that area, okay, it was quite amazing. The first one was given the kingship of the first city that Enki built in the Sumerian kings list, and that was the city Eridu, and his name was Alulim. They name him, and they name how long he ruled that city. Like I said, he ruled it for 8 shars. Well, a shar to them is 3,600 Earth years. So that's 28,800 years that Berossus wrote down in that Sumerian kings list for the very first one. Is that incredible or what?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you can keep going. You can keep going down. You can keep going down that list and see that one of them served 12 shars. This is not how long they lived. This is how long they served. So now all of a sudden, these lives from Adam to Noah don't look so long.
I mean, how long do they live? Is there a place that you've ever been able to find out that states it?
Well, it seems to depend on the circumstances they're in. The Earth was a foreign territory for them, and it caused what they called rapid aging to their bodies, and they had to do something about that. And that's where the medical officer came in to deal with the decaying of the telomeres in the DNA. These are the little end caps that, when the cell replicates, that if it doesn't shorten, then the cell's okay. If it gets some damage through the end caps, then this is what shows up as aging in our bodies. Okay, so this was reported by them, and their medical officer set about to do something about that. Well, imagine originally their DNA was such that it didn't decay, and they could live forever as long as they, uh, you know, did certain things energetically to revitalize themselves, like a battery, if you will. And this has been reported in several of their writings that even the Greek considered their gods immortal, right? Well, maybe it was just they lived so much longer than them that they couldn't verify how long they lived.
Let me
Well,
jump
imagine,
in real quick when because you brought
yeah.
up the Greeks. They kind of correct me if I'm wrong here, but isn't the overall theology of the Greek gods is they are immortal, but they don't really have a soul, and that's why they're upset with humans because humans are soul because they do have a soul.
I've never heard that. I do believe that if you look at the Anunnaki Council of 12, and I put this in my first book, I call it the God Table. Okay. Well, if all of a sudden you realize that Enlil was playing the role of Jehovah in the Old Testament, God Yahweh, and you lay this table out in the various cultures that they were exposed to. If they lived a long time, they didn't have just one culture or civilization that they were exposed to. And we see this through all the ancient civilizations. When you start really looking into it, you can come up with a God table that significantly portrays these main Anunnaki players as the gods of that culture. That's true in India. It's true in the Viking tradition. It was true in the Armenian gods when I went and looked at those, and it was also true in Asia. So when you really look, and it was true in Ireland too. So when you start looking at who these beings were and living a long time, they were also venerated in various cultures too. So that's how, let's just follow one of them through. For instance, let's just follow this being named Shida, who was the geneticist that I told you about. Well, in the Enuma Elish, he's discussed in there being affiliated with the planet Mercury. Okay, so he was also called Mercury in Rome. Well, he was called Hermes in Greece, right? Well, he was called Ningishida in the Sumerian documents, okay, as Enki's premier son, who was pretty damn amazing. As a matter of fact, as Thoth in Egypt, he introduced the calendar and writing to the
Yeah,
people.
who is Thoth? That credible
Well, this is
character.
well now you realize he is a high level Anunnaki being who, according to their records, when he escorted the first human that was created, the Adapa, to meet Anu back on Nibiru, he escorted him along with one of Enki's other kids. Well, he kind of got a mission after that he was to be kind of the head of this priesthood to facilitate the spiritual path of humans. And when you read this, you go, wow, what else did they predicate from Nibiru, which they called heaven, by the way? What else did they predicate in our path so we know what we're up against? You know. And so Thoth Ningshita is a very, very important character in this whole thing. And he's an Enki. We kind of delineate between the offspring of Enki and Enlil because they were so opposed to each other. I call them the Hatfields and the McCoys. But Ningshita was so important. He actually also has been credited with writings, massive numbers of writings. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Book of Thoth. According to the Emerald Tablets, he was the author of those as well, which he was called Thoth the Atlantean, and then came over to Egypt to establish everything that he did. Well, now you realize that Africa was given to Enki, and it would make sense that his son would be there doing what he did. So all these mystery schools to wake people up that Thoth built coincide with this kind of rival over higher consciousness that the Enelites didn't want. You could think of these as the New World Order. Let's steal all their sovereignty and their rights and just make them good slaves. Versus beings who are on a spiritual path that should be allowed to access all the constructs that, they're have a right to from. Oh, and this is what I wanted to talk about here. So at this point, you have to ask yourself, well, if the Anunnaki did really do all this and create us, then who created them? And how do they fit into this whole picture? Does that that ought to come to your mind after a while? You'll realize that. But
Oh, of course.
in their writings, Enki in particular mentioned one of their emissaries, whose name was Galzu, who brought them messages back and forth from Nibiru, and and one, so he talked about having an encounter with a being they called the creator of all, who basically we would truly call God, the source creator of all, or the infinite source, or whatever you want to call it. Well, they said they had an encounter with that being, and it turns out in the Emerald Tablets, Thoth calls him the creator of all, just as Enki does in his writings. So it's interesting that they chose that title. And in Thoth's writings, in my second book, he talks a lot about the constructs of a human. So we're looking for the manual, in essence. How were humans created in this crazy genetic experiment? What are the rules for this game? And is there a way out of this enslavement? Because everybody can probably take a detached perspective and look around the planet and see that the idea of freedom is kind of a farce.
Oh, really? I mean, just because this ain't the land of the free. It's funny because we do have a lot of really cool, I mean, advantages over some people in other countries, and I think it could be a lot better. I mean, certainly it's gotten to the point to where more people per capita, I think, are locked up in America than any other nation in the world. So yet it's the land of the free, which is quite odd. But the thing about what you're talking about right now is I find it fascinating because if this is really the history of our mankind, and if this wasn't tabloids written several thousand years ago, because this is one thing that I've talked to people about before as well. Even if it's 10,000 years old, if the writings are 20,000 years old, if they're cave paintings that are 100,000 years old, it doesn't necessarily mean one is truer or more accurate than the other. However, because there is so much out there and different writings and texts that kind of correlate with each other from different parts of the world, then you can say, yeah, that's incredible. And one thing I wanted to talk to you about was the Emerald Tablets and Thoth again for a minute, because I've always been fascinated with those writings. Do you think so you do feel that those are legit and that wasn't just written by a very smart, eclectic,
I've gone back and forth with this, and just like Sitchin's work, and ultimately for all of us, it's true. You've got to expose yourself to the knowledge and go through a process of determining what's true and what resonates with you. And usually, it turns out to be an internal feeling that's unique to you. That something could be true to you and not true to somebody else. So it may not be meant for your path, right?
Sure. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
that being said, I read it the first time and I found it pretty wild. And then I for some reason something stuck in there with me. If you applied some of the scientific thinking that we have now that we didn't have in 1925, by the way. I mean, the idea of parallel dimensions and this model in the Emerald Tablets fits perfectly with string theory. I mean, my goodness, the concept of an avatar, the ideas of differentiating energy and matter to the distinguished level that he talks about. Some of these things that end up in the Emerald Tablets, the idea of using a power that you started to allude to earlier, of this supposed ability to manifest matter out of thin air. Well, apparently this shows up in the Emerald Tablets as well. So we're like, okay, is this all just myth making, or was this true? And I went through this as well, and I had probably read them 100 times. And each time I would find corroborating evidence that couldn't possibly have been known by somebody at that time, unless they were very, very advanced. And my wife, Kristen, and I were just talking about that today, because there's naysayers on everything that comes out, So you always feel like you're in a political campaign with people throwing you barbs and everything else. But ultimately, if you can find corroboration level learning and evidence that's convincing for you, I don't think you can do any better than that. So for me, and I've read a lot of Thoth's writings, a lot of the writings in there coincide with the same character of this being that I've read in other sources. So for me, I believe they are true.
And another thing too is I'm just right now even looking at 10 amazing structures that were built who knows how long ago. The first one is Pumapunka, and then I'm looking at, let's go down here a little bit further, the Nazca lines that I was talking about as well. And then you've got the Sacsayhuaman. Then there's the, Stonehenge and some of these things. It's like,
Yeah, Göbekli Tepe was just dated at about 12,000 years old. So all of a sudden, you're like, wait a second, that predates Egypt and Samaria as well. Like I told you.
do you think they were Anunnaki then that built the stuff?
Well, I actually did some traveling back and forth to Turkey, and one of the first cities there that caught my attention was the one farther to the east, or to the west of Göbekli Tepe, and it's called Çatalhöyük. And they found some similar features there that they found at Göbekli Tepe. But it's only supposed to be about 9,000 years old, but still it was quite old. So I looked at this and I started doing some research. It's actually what got me started into history, was doing business in Turkey. And I found out that the Hittites dated very, very far back into history. And they had a set of gods. I was looking to see if they correlated with the gods that ended up back in Mesopotamia after the flood. Because you realize they would have been in this Fertile Crescent region on high ground, up in the Zagros Mountains in that region, even further to the east, if they were part of the Hittite capital, which apparently these ones were, at Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük. Well, they seem to have a very strong affiliation through the Hittites with their storm god, who was known as Iskar-Adad. Well, he's one of Enlil's. He's an Enlilite, if you will. He's from that clan. So there's a direct tie-in to one of the offspring of Enlil to the Hittite capital. Okay, so I find that very, very amazing.
Another thing too is the all-seeing eye, or the eye of Horus, has been, talked about and broken down into different possibilities of what it actually is. What's your take?
Well, this goes all the way back to the Zoroastrian period, where Enki was known as he of the sacred eye. So he was the one who was called far-sighted Enki, that basically had the ability to probably use the electromagnetic spectrum, do all these things that we talked about, to interface with the race that he spawned. So this takes us to the Isis, Osiris, Horus myth that's so important to the Egyptian understanding. And by the way, if you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Thoth, Osiris, and Isis are three of the key players in that story. Well, if you now listen to what I just told you from Samaria, Thoth, who was Ningshita, was a geneticist who did the genetic upgrade, okay? He got appointed to be mankind's teacher. Sound like the messenger of the gods to you? Pretty much the same title, right?
Right.
And Isis was the medical officer and half-sister to Enki. So if he had a child with her, and by the way, I truly believe after much research that Osiris was another incarnation of Enki. He was known as Ptah, the developer, in the early dynasties of Egypt. We're talking, you got to go back 50,000 years ago when the Egyptian civilization first spawned, according to their records, from Atlantis, okay? So Enki, I believe, was Osiris. His half-sister Isis was the other person in that story. And Horus looks like it was a new being that was kind of in line to rule because of being from the father and the half-sister. And, who knows what kind of conflict that brought up between the Anakites and the Enlilites. And by the way, they fought a lot over this very kind of thing. So I believe Horus, if you read in the story, he was very powerful, and he was given the rulership over Egypt after he smote Seth. Well, he also had some interactions with one of the other main characters, who was Thoth, who built the vessel for him to go and battle Seth and win. So here Ningshita, Thoth, and his and his father Enki and his half sister Isis, all in this story. And now it'll start to all make sense to you when you realize who they really were. Okay, and this is where it gets really difficult for the idea of these beings having avatar bodies and that they could have more than one. This is the crazy part of Thoth's teachings, is they would go into a stasis state and be able to roam out of their body like an out-of-body experience and occupy any avatar host that was of their genetic, had their genetic mark on it, right? That's all of us.
Now, you said Seth, or did you say Set?
Set.
Okay, because there's now the Church of Set, and this is based on the ancient Egyptian deity, and I guess you could predate that to the Anunnaki. But the reference to Set, it seems as if that particular deity is different than the others. And it certainly now is looked at as black magic, very dark, satanic, Luciferian. Yeah. So there's a lot of different names you could put to it, but what's your connection there?
We got to do a couple more names.
Yeah, I mean, of course. So please do.
This God table so we know who the main players are. So now you realize Isis is the Mary Magdalene figure who's the mother of humanity, right, in the real story. Right. Enki was the genetic creator. Even though he's not God, he knows there's a creator of all. So now you've got two new creators you got to deal with. One's a scientist, and the other one is the source of all, which he venerated, by the way, which is quite interesting. So the other player that we didn't talk about was some of the main children of Enki and Enlil. The firstborn of Enki was Marduk. He was the chief deity of Babylon. He didn't belong in Babylon. He was in Enlil's territory. That's why they went to war. Babylon was in the Mesopotamian region up where Iraq is now. Well, that belonged to Enlil. He was a very powerful deity, by the way. And he ended up actually defeating Enlil in approximately 2000 BCE and took over the Anunnaki Council rank of 50, which for them was the Lord of the Earth. So it went 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 for the men, and then 55, 45, 35, 25, like that for the women. And there were 6 men and 6 women. It was balanced. Okay, so now we're starting to get these biblical histories. We know who Allah is, who was Nanar Sin, who is the crescent moon god that is now followed by Islam, right? Now we know that Enlil is behind the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who's propping up the Jewish state and America. Okay? All of a sudden, we talked about Marduk, but he disappeared, right? Or is he around? So all of a sudden, you have to then ask yourself, are they here? Did they leave? This main body force that we're describing right now did not leave. They stayed here. Now, whether they took interim voyages to Mars or the moon to set up way stations or do whatever, that's possible, but they're still here. And they're running the show, just so you know. Speaking of Saturn, the holiday of Saturnia in Rome was a holiday that was associated with the god Apollo, eventually. Well, Apollo was none other than Ninurta, who was Enlil's premier warring son. Okay? So now all of a sudden, these Greek gods, you realize, came exactly from the Anunnaki Council. The Greek pantheon came from the Anunnaki Council. Okay?
Okay, like Medusa.
Well, she wasn't a primary Olympian goddess. There were only 12. Remember, then they had all the minor ones, and these are all their kids, okay? All the ones that may have been born directly of 2 gods, or more likely, if they were demigods, they were born of a human and one of these Anunnaki.
Let me jump in real quick. Each planet in Greek mythology represents a certain god? And that's one thing that I'm wondering is, how is there a connection there? I mean, I know if you look at...
I put this in my God table. You beat me to it. So we started out in Sumer, where we had Enki and Enlil and Ninmon and Hartzog and Ninurta and blah blah blah. And did I say Inanna? I meant to. Okay.
Okay.
And there were other ones as well. Well, when you go over to the Greek, you end up with the Olympian gods. But when you went to Rome, you ended up with Jupiter, who was Enlil. Poseidon or Neptune was Enki. They claimed these planets, by the way, in the Enuma Elish as well. They already had laid claims on these. And I believe Uranus belonged to Anu, and on and on and on. And Mercury belonged to Ningshita, who was Thoth. Okay, so once you get this table in front of you, you can see the darn name and what culture they were in. it'll make a lot more sense to you. And then the continuity of those attributes is clear through the cultures and the symbols too. By the way, look at Thoth's caduceus that came up in the Garden of Eden because his father had it before he gave it to him. Right, this winged staff with two snakes around it. Well, this ended up with Thoth in Egypt and also with Hermes in Greece. He's still carrying that same symbol. So if you pay attention to the symbols, you can also a lot of times pin down which one of these guys it is. Now look at the trident that's carried by Poseidon. Okay, that was Enki's. So you start to see these symbols, and you're like, okay, well, they clearly had a set of coat of arms or symbols, so you can start to figure this out.
Right. And I'm looking at the Norse gods and goddesses right now, like Odin, the Asir.
All those ones. I have a table on my blog that lays out who those are based on who I think they were from the Anunnaki. And I'm starting to do this with every culture because it just keeps coming up.
Now, do you think there's a spiritual connection as well, or some type of metaphysical connection to these planets, or is it just real estate for them? They've got a deed to that planet, kind of like in Jupiter ascending.
No, I think there is a energetic connection that if you basically line up planets and put them in the energy field of the Earth, you can change the resultant energy that you get here without getting too complicated. So, if you were born into a zodiacal sign that had that particular energy for that time, it may have some interaction with our DNA that creates the archetypes. And this was a design construct from Enki, who also did the zodiac. So, so these ancient methods that they use for tracking the stars, designing their avatars, keeping them in check, we're just now getting sophisticated enough where we can actually even talk about these kind of concepts. Genetic engineering, right? So even the idea of a energetic barrier, like was shown in Star Wars, where you could keep beings out and other ones in. Well, look at what's happened with Boeing and some of these other defense contracting companies. They're actually filing patents because they now understand how to do that. So as our incremental knowledge grows, the idea of the Anunnaki story becomes even more believable.
And you think they're still alive and well, and they're the ones that are still controlling the scenes, like Enlil and Enki?
I do. In my first book, I posited the question: will the Enkyites find a way to thwart the Enlilite push for a new world order? And it's not just Enlil, okay? He was kind of the great destroyer, by the way, in the past, and he was associated with the Temple of Zeus, which was in Pergamum, which was called the seat of Satan. Okay, so he was your Satan figure, the great destroyer. Well, look, he portrayed himself as God in the Old Testament. Isn't that the biggest reverse lie you've ever heard? Well, that's the truth. And the one made out to be the devil is actually your benefactor and creator, at least from a genetic standpoint. That doesn't mean from a higher energetic evolutionary standpoint that you shouldn't be seeking to live according to the tenets given to you by the creator of all. If you want out of this enslaved simulation that the Anunnaki created for us, if you don't, just stay here, be reincarnated into a slave, and keep doing it.
Well, now let's talk about this for a minute, because certainly if you look at quantum entanglement, physics, if you get into, there is no finite point really, it's all just based upon vibrational frequencies. Solid matter is really controversial, yet we certainly, when we sit down in a chair, we don't fall through the chair, then through the floor. We don't put our hand through the wall typically, unless you're having an out-of-body experience, which some people do. So a lot of people talk about The Matrix, and I think that was a great movie to kind of relate some of the possibilities that are out there. But are we in a matrix? Is this construct that we're in literally like a simulation? And do you think that when people go through that tunnel into the white light, that's the reset button, and then it brings you back into this construct? Because there's a lot of speculation there.
Yeah, I know. I've been hearing that speculation. It's like the final fear that you're going to be tricked at your death. That's funny. Well, let's talk about let's go back to our senses just real quick. Our eyes can see from 400 to 700 nanometers, not very far. Our ears go 0 to about 20 kilohertz. Our brain waves go from about a half hertz to anywhere from 20 to 60 hertz, depending on who you read or who you measure. So what I'm telling you is we have a very limited experience of what's out there. And what's out there isn't a direct mapping. I mean, even the visual system goes through a crazy polar to rectangular coordinate transform before it shows up into your memory banks in order to map little symbols that represent what you're seeing in the outside. So it's not like a projector screen, okay? It's an interpretation. Your brain is interpreting through the synthesis of your sensors what's going on around you and what's out there, what's real, what's not. So if you were designed with a set of sensors to only see a certain limited set of what's going on, to me that's an enslavement, at least from a sensory standpoint, first and foremost.
Well, do you think the Anunnaki can see with see 100% of the light spectrum here, from 0 hertz to 100 quadrillion kilohertz? I mean, what's your thought about that?
Well, I think they actually come from a higher dimension than we do. And when they come into this plane of existence in the third dimension, I believe they have to take on a body. And according to their writings and thoughts as well, and many others, they're avatars. They can create a body that looks any way they want to. Now, this is the really interesting part to me is, how is this avatar created? Remember we talked about Enki creating the first one in the Atrahasis account. And that turned out to be our atom, right, or our Damu. Well, now stop and think about this. There's a concept that, like you said, all things are basically a vibration. The material world is illusory. Really, it's mostly just frequency with bonds, various bonds between these little particles, but most of it's free space. And everything is controlled by frequency, including the brain, the frequent, the speed of light times the wavelength, or the wavelength times the frequency creates the speed of light. So there's a frequency component in every aspect of us and all material. So this is why a lot of traditions would teach that the material world is transient and it's not real. It's not the real truth. Okay, and this comes from several traditions. Well, from a science tradition now, if you look at it and say, could what I'm seeing and touching and feeling with the limited sensors that I have, remember, I could train a robot to touch something, perceive the amount of back pressure, and to say, well, that's a solid or a liquid. So we put all these labels on things in our holographic simulator. Okay, we come up with a common understanding what a rock and a tree and all these things are and how they interact with the forces. So we could describe an apple falling from a tree and call it this gravity force that enacted on it, but we didn't know what it was. And we still really have just now gotten to the point where we can measure a gravity wave just this year, from what I understand. So you with me? So,
oh yeah.
At this point, if I were to create a being that could see in this wavelength, then basically I've stuck them into an environment that was either optimized for them or they were optimized for that environment, one or the other. Okay? And now this gets to the really deep question. And I know you probably saw Hunger Games and maybe saw the movie The 13th Floor that talks about being in a simulator, in a hologram.
Right.
Well, in the Emerald Tablets, Thoth talks about the creator of all's constructs, where he created time, or he or she, the creator of all, he doesn't call it he, and also created the laws of matter. So I got really interested in the laws of matter, because ultimately what you and I are saying is the same thing, is that all matter, whether we perceive it to be solid or not, is created from fundamental particles that are stitched together through various bonds. Okay? It's energy holding it all together. Well, we know that energy equals mass times the speed of light, according to Einstein squared. So there's a direct relationship between how much plutonium you have and how much bang you get when you explode it, right? And we can calculate this because of that simple equation, right?
Right.
So at this point, imagine that these advanced beings, the Anunnaki, decided to create a meat host that's going to be using these sensors to navigate its way through this environment that they happened upon, or they were able to see at like you said, maybe at a much different spectrum than we could. As a matter of fact, if they could be in the sixth dimension, they don't even need a body. So they can take on a body if they need to. And if you don't have a body, you're not constrained by time. So I don't think they're constrained in spectra either. So they could see whatever is there.
So this is like a cosmic video game to them.
Exactly, exactly. And they're the game masters, and we're the pawns that are fighting their wars, building their buildings, occasionally stumbling on some esoteric knowledge from the Vedas or wherever that allows us to have an energy experience to be at the same possible frequency that they're on and have, I don't know, some form of communication. And many people have reported that.
I had a guy on here, the Leak Project, a couple weeks ago, and his name's Boris, and it's really cool because he literally will go outside. He works in Brooklyn, and he'll go out during the day when literally he says he makes contact with these entities, and he goes outside, and you can see these lights that'll show up, and they'll start changing colors, and then it'll get like metallic and then purple and then white and change shape and do all these weird things, and it'll hang out for 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and he'll bring his coworkers out. They'll look at it. I mean, a bunch of people see it. It's downtown
Oh
Brooklyn.
yeah, yeah. Well, now ask yourself this question: if you know that there were forces here that were benevolent to mankind from the Anunnaki, and those that were not so happy with them that wanted them all wiped out, how do you know which one's up there flying around in its little saucer as you're luring it down there to have an encounter with you? It's very important to kind of know when you get to this level, if you're going to play with entities of this powerful, it's probably good to know which ones you're playing with, because you could invite something into your lap that
Hey, look, there's a bear. Let's get it some honey and let's.
yeah, all you got to do is give them permission, and guess what? They can walk into your meat host and take you over.
That's a good point, man.
Well, listen, in the
Well
Middle
said.
Ages, when they were going on witch hunts, that's part of the knowledge that they had, is they knew that the Watchers, these beings, had the ability to take on avatar bodies, and they called it possession, and for that matter, I want to make something else clear. We got all our characteristics from the Anunnaki, from serial killer to saint. They had the same thing. They had beings that were really benevolent, really wise, and they had people that you probably should have kept them in a cage. So what didn't we answer about the Anunnaki?
Okay, Coneheads.
One of my favorite movies, absolutely favorite movies.
A classic, yeah, indeed. Dan Aykroyd played that very well. I remember back in Saturday Night Live when they would have it was Halloween, and then people would show up at the door and they'd give out beer and eggs.
Oh, I know that was a very clever movie. Whoever thought that up,
Yeah.
absolutely one of my favorites, especially after you've heard the Sumerian stuff. Then go back and watch it again. It's really good.
Makes it even better. Cool.
Yeah. So one thing we didn't really talk about is what's going on with the New World Order and where do we fit in? So part of that has to do with the term limits that the Anunnaki set up for themselves, and whether they played nicely and decided to follow it or didn't was kind of hit or miss. So you realize all these temples they set up that are aligned to the equinox and to the solstice was done to keep track of where they were in celestial time, because they were using the zodiac as their term limits. Each zodiacal age, it seems like they had some arrangement to change commands. So now that we're changing from Pisces to Aquarius, we should expect to see major changes going on in the constructs of the Anunnaki Council. And it's happened in the past, and I believe it's happening right now. So
Okay.
knowing who's in line to rule and who was ruling will kind of help you understand where humans fit into this game that we want to play called the evolution of consciousness, and getting past our enslavement to what we see as the Garden of Eden or heaven experience, whatever it is that we perceive.
And that's another thing I've often asked is, was religion created to be a prison of the mind to keep people in this construct? Because in many ways, when somebody that's religious says, I picked up this book on mysticism, and then somebody else is going to say, oh, well, that's of the devil. You're satanic.
Oh yeah.
So you can't really expand your mind a lot of times if you're within in that realm.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, the truth that I've discovered about religion is, unless they're leading you to the place where you're having an internal experience, and it doesn't matter about the building or how much you're paying in your dowry to them or any of that, unless they're leading you to a place where you're energy is changing, and you're having a wings of Mercury experience, such as your pineal glands firing. You're having an experience with your true creators and connection back to the creator of all. You realize you're an immortal being, and that you've been lied to and told that if you do this and do that, somebody will come back and save you at some point in the future. Give me a break. All religions I just told you, at least the three major ones, came from the lineage of Abram.
What about Hinduism?
Well, Hinduism, actually, we didn't go into that deeply, but Inanna was the other being, when they drew lots, that was given the region of the Indus Valley. So she went over, and so the sacred goddess, I believe her role, knowing her attributes, and I did a god table for the Indian religions as well, and it's not perfectly complete, but it also ties into the planets. She was Kali, and this fits her persona exactly, as she was involved in many, many wars in Mesopotamia. She was definitely the seductress, and also a lethal black widow, as far as I'm concerned. Ask Gilgamesh, who was lured into her lair in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He wouldn't even go. He was scared of her.
Now, Native Americans across the globe, it seems like they're just being systematically destroyed. Their culture, the people. Yeah, I know there's some nice casinos out there and stuff, but in reality, the majority of the native cultures, not only here in America, but everywhere, just seems like it's withering away. And I've often wondered why. So do you feel that maybe the natives had more of a connection to source, or something that the Anunnaki just don't want around, so they're trying to eliminate that to make sure that it's just out of the history books, I guess?
I do think that's the case. And if you look into some of their origin stories, that goes back to Athlon. It sounds a lot like Atlanta, right? Where the 7 tribes spawned the Aztec race and many others in Mexico. This was significantly connected to the being Quetzalcoatl. Well, Quetzalcoatl was another name for Ningshita Thoth. That was his other AKA name. So when you realize that, and why the Mayans were probably slaughtered by the followers of the orders that were given to them for Cortez and Pizarro, who was under the Christian rule. By the way, I want to make it clear that the Christian God that came in with the Roman czars was not Enki, it was Enlil. Everything in Rome was under Enlil's command. So you want to see what a new world order could look like? Go back to there and see about circus and bread and complete tyranny. That's what you're in. That's what you're going to be in for if this change of command doesn't go well.
Have you read Revelations?
Absolutely.
So, fascinating book. I probably read it a dozen times. And, one of the things in that book is it talks about the New Jerusalem that descends from heaven, and it's described as like this cube. I think of the Borg cube with just more emeralds and rubies and gold around it versus this dark, box per se, because that's kind of how it's described in the Bible, and it talks about these giant locusts with breastplates of iron that go around.
It sounds like an Apache helicopter, right? Listen,
Yeah.
I want to back up. I want to back up something just real quick before we do the Bible says anymore. And I do quote the Bible quite a bit, but I use it to point out significant evidence. And there's a lot of truth in it, so I don't want people to hear me say it's just evil. You need to understand that if the deity who was in charge in Rome had editorial oversight on every document that went into the composition of the canonical Bible in the Council of Nicaea, which was released from Rome, okay? You're in denial because when you realize who Enlil was. Listen, we just said he was playing the role of Satan. He was the great destroyer. He doesn't like mankind. He wants us gone. He thinks we're genetically inferior. So when you realize he had editorial oversight in laying out these destructive prophecies in the Bible, everything from the destruction of Damascus and Isaiah and all the other ones. If they could see an entire zodiacal house, you think they couldn't make these kind of predictions and make them come true? Easy. It's a war plan. It's a war plan. And I want to reemphasize one other thing that I didn't get to bring up is that in the warring plan between the Enkyites and Enlilites, and this is where the Christians usually get very aroused, go to Egypt, just the south where Enki's headquarters was. Ningshita was there running mystery schools. He had been for a long time, Thoth, Ningshita. And he was graduating these beings, raising their consciousness against what Enlil wanted for his close chosen people, the Jews, in the Levant, okay? So anytime you take a people and go, you're my chosen ones, and you prop them up like that, wow, that creates a separation in us and them, and it's a way of dividing and conquering and creating wars. And it's been going on ever since, okay? So I want you to understand, though, that Enki's plan all along was to allow us to have access to higher consciousness through these latent circuits, through through the chakras that he created in us, and the endocrine system that gets turned on by that, this energy and matter. He wanted that for us. So when this being in the New Testament was sent in to teach these humans to a better way to wake up and access this kingdom of heaven that everybody wants, he was very specific in saying it was the kingdom of heaven within you. Okay, this is where the energy meets matter in you. And this is at your chakras and other, organs in your body, where you can have this experience of the universal source that the religious organizations don't want you to have. They want you to go and be entertained and give them money and do all those things. But you show me one of them where they're actually trying to get to a higher spiritual place by meditating, doing yoga, doing all the things that we know through history have worked to still yourself and get to that place with a brainwave change. That's how it's measured, as a brainwave. If they're not doing that, then yeah, they're an enslaving organization that's leading you astray, telling you not to do anything now because that'll be taken care of when some being comes later at some future point in time. Wow, what a way to disempower people from doing something now. What they have, the constructs that were given to them to deal with it right here and right now.
Well,
and that's so important.
It is important, and even in the Bible, it says that Jesus says to his people that all these great things you've seen me do, you're going to be able to do and more. And then I've talked to so that I think is.
Well, it shows up in the book, The Masters of the Far East. Wow, okay. What a book! I highly recommend that one. I haven't got all the way through it, but it's amazing. Well, I want to back up and tell you another couple of AKA names for Ningshita. He was also known as Buddha. He was known as Jesus. He was known as Melchizedek, and several other names. Hermes Trismegistus. Okay, all these other names. He was the wizard Merlin and all those shows. He was the magician in the tarot cards. Okay, he was our appointed teacher, and he's playing all these different avatar roles with these primitive workers, trying to wake us up. That's his job.
So, and you've heard of Moloch?
Yes, I have.
Have you been able to put a connection to that name?
Yeah, and that brings up something in the headlines that we ought to talk about. In Palmyra, Syria, there's a set of ruins there that were venerating Baal. Well, this was another name for Marduk, who was the chief deity of Babylon, Enki's son, who kind of went to war in a territory that didn't belong to him. And somehow I think they ended up at odds with each other, Enki and his son Marduk. So all of a sudden now you see that there's a temple after this ISIS group, right? Think about how they're smearing the goddess who created mankind in her womb, Isis.
Right.
She's affiliated with a bunch of barbarians, right? So this temple, this portal, whatever this arch is, the venerating Marduk that was affiliated with so many really disgusting physical acts, everything from child sacrifice to orgies, is going to now be built in New York City by the 17th of this month, so that it can be available for the festival of some Baal's festival that talks about light. Do you know what the name of this festival is? I can't remember. Baalith, I think is the name of the festival that happens on March. April 31st to May 1st, somewhere in there. Well, they're trying to have these arches set up by then. So this all of a sudden goes, wait a second, not just two of them. They're talking about 1,000 of them. This is way over the top, okay? What I and I will just, and I haven't talked about this much, but Marduk is involved. Marduk is the New World Order force that is heading up what's going on in Europe. And according to the ex-Canadian Defense Minister, Paul Hellyer, there were two tall whites, that's his code word for the Anunnaki, that were in the United States since World War II, that were predicating all foreign and domestic policy, basically running the country, puppeteering it from the game room. Okay. Well, now all of a sudden you realize, well, if Enlil, who signs the Eagle, is running the United States, and Marduk, the son of Enki, who's turned on him, is running Europe, the old Roman Empire, right? The 10 pieces of the old Roman Empire, he's re-established those in the EU. And now I think this is where it's going to get crazy, because the zodiacal house is changing and the new rulers are coming in, and the old rulers are trying to establish a new world order that can resist the new changes. And I think it's going to fail, but probably in accordance with the writings, there's going to be a World War III, and a lot of people are going to die. And this coincides with the book of Revelations as well.
And also the Lucifer craze right now. I mean, that's a real popular genre if you look at the TV series out there, and just a lot of people talking that way. We were discussing this before the show, and you said that was one of the names that was more difficult to pinpoint.
Well, I've been watching this one because it had me fooled for a while. What do we know? It only shows up in the canonical Bible, in our King James or New International Version. It only shows up one time. Actually, it shows up in the King James Version, but not in the New International Version. They call it Morning Star. Well, this is Isaiah 14:12, I think it is. Anyway, here, if you really study this verse, it's the only place that a Latin term from the Latin Vulgate shows up into a Hebrew document. Well, listen, Latin didn't exist when the Hebrews wrote this, so all of a sudden you realize there's a word in there that doesn't belong, okay? And you have to ask yourself why, if you knew that Enlil had oversight writing the canonical Bible to give you his version of him being God and his half-brother being the devil, okay? So at this point, if you read Isaiah 14:12 and read it closely, it's all about the king Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, but it has nothing to do with a fallen state or fallen star. This actually is a reference to Venus. Okay, the morning star that we see in the sky is a reference to Venus, and the term Lucifer means bearer of light, and that's what it was in the Latin. So all of a sudden you realize that Enlil, through his editorial oversight in the Bible, has affiliated a bearer of light with a fallen king, Nebuchadnezzar. No, yeah, and then you can go to the Revelations account, and they say, well, Jesus was the morning star, so is Jesus Lucifer, right? This is what it started. Well, you have to understand that Lucifer is actually not a name, but is a functional title, a light bearer. Now, in the Star Wars sequence, you have Darth Vader, who's dark light, and then then the opposing force, which is the Force, which is white light, right? So you have this polarity of light. Well, this is no different than what you have with Enki and Enlil. They were opposed to each other, and I think they're part of the polarity that's being played out in this simulator right now. In the change of the zodiacal house, the last house has been run by Enlilites. That's why we've had nothing but destruction and wars. So, and pandemics, and you could go on. And man's inhumanity, through the last zodiacal house, shouldn't even be allowed in the annals of history. It's so disgusting. It's like it needs a matrix reload and reset right there, because it's really embarrassing, truly. Think about your galactic neighbors looking at us, what we're doing.
Oh, I mean, it's insane. I was talking about this earlier. If you've ever watched footage of Black Friday where you've got these thugs beating up grandma at Walmart because there's a plasma TV that's on sale for $199. I mean, it's retarded, I mean, and most people are more concerned about seeing something on MTV or watching the latest, sitcom or something about, reality housewives or some ridiculous crap than actually getting some type of knowledge to better themselves and create balance again. So
Well,
That's
that's what
insane.
culture was created for. Governments created these constructs to enslave the people, to control the mindset, control what the dialogue is, what conversation is bouncing around in their head, right? Well, if you control the information, you control the mindset. And I'm pretty sure that that's why they run really highly sophisticated neural networks with all the inputs they're feeding in and training them based on this situation and that situation. Neural networks are great at pattern recognition and prediction. So if you gather enough data on somebody, you could actually do like what we said without even having to monitor them. You could determine what their intent is, what their next thing they're going to do, just by studying them.
Oh yeah, there was a study several years ago, and there's certain software that can predict people's movements based upon where they've gone with their cell phone within over 90% accuracy. So, I mean,
Yeah. We can be, so these are the kind of things that are being put into place by New World Order forces that I think are trying to mimic the capabilities of what the Anunnaki had. Some of that technology is not truly being given to man, but I think at the high level, the Anunnaki are running the whole show. Whether it's and all the world is a stage to them. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Are we here because they're training us how to evolve by showing us all these things? Good and bad, war and peace, light and dark, all the polarities that we get exposed to. And you have to ask yourself why. Well, are they responsible for bringing us up to speed so that we can be introduced to galactic neighbors without embarrassing them? It's possible. It's hard to know, but they still need a slave force. So as long as we're building infrastructure for them, getting all the resources, doing everything, then everything's happy. But imagine we all stopped and we weren't creating anything. This brings up the idea of why couldn't they, with their advanced technology, just create it out of thin air? Well, some of them could. And this actually comes up in what I'm writing about in my latest attempt at writing a screenplay about the Anunnaki.
oh,
Is
very cool.
Yeah, according to the Emerald Tablets, Enki, or the dweller of Atlantis, had this particular power, and other races did as well, where they had evolved past the point where they were required to do labor to get what they needed. They could basically just instantly think of it, and then using some sort of quantum encryption encoding of the reality matrix, they could take light, combine it with atomic elements, and create the matter. Right? They could do this. They could build buildings. They could do everything with their mind. And even in the discussions about the building of Atlantis, Poseidon, the dweller who was Enki, apparently did that, and they called it the power of Yolton. Well, you go to the Himalayas and start talk about some of the capabilities of the Tibetan Buddhists and some of the writings that they've done. They claim to have, some of them have this power where they can manifest their food and things that they need, that are in their path. And I think it's a fascinating thing to study because it really makes you try to understand physics to see how this could be done.
Right. And I've heard that you've got to have three strands of DNA and then you can get to that level, and a lot of different possibilities. I've also heard about those people in the Tibetan mountains and stuff, like you said, that can just manifest things from nothing. But it's incredible to think about. Certainly the possibilities are amazing. Now, also, I know that we've been going on for about 2 hours now, and I could pick your brain for another 24 hours. But one of the things that I would like to discuss before we close out tonight is Nibiru and the return, possibly. There's been a lot of footage out there that, like could be very well false or photoshopped, lens flare, solar flare, whatever. And like I said, there's a few out there that I definitely think are legit. But do you think it's actually coming back and getting to the point to where it's close? And what is it like? I mean, what is Nibiru exactly like? Because if it was referred to as heaven, it's got to be pretty fascinating if it's got a gold atmosphere.
Well, when I wrote my first book, The Anunnaki Nibiru, I had synthesized data from past events, trying to determine what everybody else was doing was, well, if you could find one place where it happened in the past, you just add 3,600 years and maybe figure out when it's going to pass again. And so I didn't make the most significant effort when I was writing the book. I was more focused on the fact that they created us, and I wasn't worried about their home planet so much. Well, as time went on, I noticed a lot of other people were very interested in that, and especially since I knew about Dr. Harrington meeting with Zecharia Sitchin, and this was about December of 1990. But prior to that, Dr. Harrington had been involved in some work at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., where he was the chief scientist. Okay, he wasn't just some schmuck, he was the head dog. And they had been following this quest to find some large object in the solar system that was somehow perturbing Neptune and Uranus, and it had to be bigger than they were to do the perturbing, right? So this had been going on. This hunt had been going on since like 1790 or so. And this is how we ended up finding Pluto and a few other planets, looking for this big perturber out in space. Well, so I actually sat down last year and wrote out what I knew based on physical evidence, and the only physical real evidence we had came from the scientists at JPL and NASA and Caltech, who were involved with the search for Planet X. This was back in 1983 when they started releasing their information, and this is Neugebauer and Harrington and a few others. But Neugebauer and Harrington were the two key players as far as I'm concerned at that time. One of them worked at Caltech and JPL, that was Neugebauer, and Harrington was off on the East Coast. So they released an article in '83, and this came out in several papers, stating they had found the planet and approximately how far away it was. Neugebauer thought it was 50 billion miles from the sun, and it wasn't moving, wasn't coming in, so don't freak out, right? Whereas Harrington disagreed with him and said, no, I see it as 5 billion miles outside of Pluto. And Pluto's only 3.67 billion miles from the sun. So we're talking about 8.8 billion miles from the sun. Not very far. This was in 1983. Well, in 1990, he had an orbital chart in his hand when he did a video interview with Zecharia Sitchin, saying, this is where we think it is. And he showed Sitchin the diagram, and Sitchin showed him his diagram, and the only major difference they had in their diagram was where it crossed through the zodiacal house based on precession, if you accounted for that correctly. Okay, so I did an analysis of what Harrington said from the IRS satellite and his little orbital chart that he showed where it was. If everybody looked at it, you could go a relational chart and see, well, what's this thing to scale? What was it, just a dot happenstance he put on this paper? It shows up in the video, so I did some analysis of it, okay? Well, based on that, and let's just go from 1990 or so when Sitchin met with Harrington, they had quite a bit of data, and they both agreed that it was the planet that was talked about in the Enuma Elish and by the Sumerians, and that the same one that Harrington was trying to find with the Voyager program and the Viking explorers. So anyway, so they were in agreement, which is pretty shocking. Well, you know, he gave us the data, and what we really needed was a blink. You know, here it is at one point, here it is at another point, so we can determine how fast it's moving and whether it's going in or going out, right? That kind of stuff. Well, he was in the process of getting that data when he ended up dying. He apparently got the data when he went to New Zealand to Black Birch Observatory, and he died shortly thereafter when he came back of rapid throat cancer because they didn't want him to speak. So
that's terrible, man. And that makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, his data was valid, and I read all his reports that he published. And Tom Van Flanderen came after him and did a lot of good work too. And they both believed pretty much the same thing, at least at one point in time. Well, if you took these numbers and you could actually come up with a blink based on what he said, you could compute the velocity and do some simple math. Going, if this big ball, this planet's moving this fast, and we know it, according to the Sumerians, it takes 3,600 years. We can kind of figure out, you know, how long, where it is, and how long it takes, kind of thing, because he told us. So I did that in my orbital report, and I ran some math on it. And there's 3 velocities: one at perihelion, one at aphelion, and then the average velocity in between. So they're different too. The one in close to the sun, it moves very fast. And the one out near aphelion, way away from our sun, and I believe part of their constellation is our binary sun. They call it a brown dwarf, but this is Herculobus or Wormwood, whatever you want to call it. They have a sun that's part of their system as well. So, based on that, I did some real simple math, compared this with what Harrington had on his linear chart showing the diagrams, and I discovered that very conservatively with the velocity and the orbital scalar that planet, if he truly saw it in 1990, like he said, and it was only 5 billion miles outside of Pluto, it could very well be here at perihelion with our sun. From July of last year to the end of this year was a rough window. Now, it could be refined more if you had some more the parameters of the size of the planet, which, by the way, I calculated it based on the size that we found in VA 243. Now, on this, I included this in my report, how I did this. But basically, it looks like it's 17.8 times bigger than the Earth. That's how much bigger Nibiru is than the Earth. Yeah. So it doesn't have to come very close, but just from the interactive effects from plasma, gravity, CMEs, X flares, all those kind of things that will get triggered up. It doesn't have to be very close and still have a massive impact on our Earth.
So you think that it's going to have a really? Do you think we're in trouble? I mean, should the electrical grid's going to go down, possibly stuff like that? Do you feel?
Well, it's passed many, many times in the past. Every 3,600 years, the Earth is still here. But we've seen a lot of civilizations disappear for no real explainable reason. They're just the rise and fall, right? And I think some of those cataclysms were definitely affiliated with Nibiru's passage. And it really just depends on where the Earth is relative to the Sun and Nibiru when this happens. Because if you're on the opposite side of the barn when the planet comes through, perihelion, you're probably not going to get the CME and all the disturbances from the sun, even though you may get some tilting of your polar orbit. I mean, your tilt axis. You might have a magnetic effect and change the orbit of your planet slightly, or the tilt axis anyway. So I think there have been many major floods and lots of minor floods, according to the Egyptians in their records that were given to Solon in Greece. And I think we're on a planet that's prone to disturbances by other planets coming in close to the sun, cyclical wobbles from other galaxies that are affecting ours. There's a lot of factors that seem to affect us. It's not stagnant.
Yeah, I mean, indeed. So I got to tell you, it sure has been nice to speak with you. You can tell that you're very well versed and just so articulate. You know this stuff just like that. No pause or hesitation. I mean, certainly it seems like you've got this all just, memorized.
Well, it's interesting. How does one retain a whole bunch of knowledge like that? How does it happen? I watch other people do interviews, and I don't have that knowledge set that they have. It's like, wow, to put all those pieces together and have it all in your head. It's an inspiration. It comes because you're supposed to know that information and share it with others, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. I never planned to be an ancient historian or anything. I was an electrical engineer. I designed circuits and systems and dealt with communication protocols, and and programming chips, and totally a nerdy scientist.
Right, building lasers with Lockheed Martin and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, and I got to deal with some really neat technology, which helped me understand a lot more about the nature and the fundamentals of light, because light is the key to understanding how we're made and how we can possibly have the fullest experience while we're here doing our Avatar mission. It's all about energy and light.
Well said. Well said, Gerald. Well, I got to tell you, folks, for those that have had a chance to listen to this show, check out GeraldClark77.com. Also, you've got two just awesome books, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, The Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising. Is it best to get these through your website or to go? I've also noticed you got a couple thumb drives here, so it looks like they can get audiobooks also.
Yeah, those are the audiobooks. You can do a digital download on the audiobooks if you've got a good bandwidth connection. We usually end up having real good success with that. People really like the audiobooks, and we put them on thumb drives for people that don't have good bandwidth connection. And CDs are kind of a thing of the past, and these are 2 gig drives. So yeah, and I really love the audiobooks. It really helps me get back into the frame of mind I was in when I was writing them. And my second book's 582 pages, so it's pretty long. And but some of this stuff is so esoteric in there that it really helps to hear the Atlantean rhythms as some of the stuff is read, and have it along with the book as well. I mean, what if the internet goes down? We get an EMP, and the only thing you have left are books.
Right. It's always nice to just hold that book in your hand too. It feels good when the pages flip through your fingers and your thumb. It's
Yeah, I'm old fashioned that way too. I like the new digital stuff and everything, but when push comes to shove, I want a book.
right on.
So,
Yeah. Well, thanks, Gerald. It was a pleasure, man. Seriously, I hope we can have the opportunity to speak with you again sometime.
well, I definitely will. I think it's been a great conversation. There's a lot more we can cover. So, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful chat. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. Will do, and you have a fantastic night.
You too. Take care.
Take care.